It's my great pleasure to be the moderator of this talk. And I just briefly introduce our speaker, Professor Shellen Wu, Xiao 老师, to the audience. I think that Professor Wu was trained as a historian at Harvard and Princeton, and she got her PhD at Princeton University, and then once taught at University of Tennessee, and now is the Gipson Chair in Transnational History at Lehigh University. And I think Professor Wu's main research interests including the global history and also the history of science. And her first book, the name is Empires of Coal, Feeling China's Entry into the Modern World Order, 1860 to 1920, was published with Stanford University Press in 2015. And also she has published widely in the top journals like the American Historical Review, Nature, and also other journals in history, history of science, and other subjects. And her second book, which is closely connected with today's talk, I think, and the name is Birth of the Geopolitical Age, Global Frontiers and the Making of Modern China. So the book is forthcoming in late summer this year. So we are actually quite looking forward to this new book, and also quite looking forward to today's talk, which is exactly on this special topic. So I think just one thing that as today we have this webinar here, so if you have any questions, please type this question in the Q&A box in our webinar. And I think after the talk of Professor Shellen Wu, and we will go into this Q&A session. So I think I just briefly introduce our speaker, and now the time yours, Shellen.
Thank you so much, Danko, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Thompson, for the invitation. So ever since I met you actually in Fudan, for the Mingtianjian group, it's been a great source of inspiration, our conversations. So let me share my screen and we will get started. So today's talk is closely related to my forthcoming book on the birth of the geopolitical age. Let me start actually with two different quotes. One, a poem by Du Fu, which I first encountered in college. 国破山河在，城春草木深. And the other is a quote that I encountered in the research for this book, from a book by Nicholas Spickman from 1942. In the 1930s, the Rockefeller Foundation sponsored a number of programs on international studies, including the Yale International Studies Center. And this book came out of that group. Spickman, whose book set the agenda for post-war American international relations, commented that ministers come and ministers go, even dictators die, but mountain ranges stand unperturbed. When I read the quote, I was thinking about the way that you have people across different centuries in different places come to the same insights about the lasting influence of geography, even as human lives are ephemeral on this landscape. Du Fu himself would pass away an itinerant in a declining empire, while Spickman died a few years afterwards from cancer, before he lived to see the golden age of American influence in the so-called American century after World War II. In the past couple of years, especially from a 2020 panel that Stefan Tanaka chaired, I started thinking about the way that we should think across borders but also across time periods. And I include here a quote from Diderot that recast in the mode of a taxonomic ordering of things, chronology becomes the alibi of time, a way of making use of time without reflecting on it. And in some ways, when we base ourselves purely in national histories and follow the standard periodization, we are using this taxonomic ordering of things, using an alibi of time without reflecting on the way that people's lives cut across time, and across national boundaries. So I start here as a way to think about the ways that I started to think how I should methodologically base my book. At the same time, in a related side project, I was collaborating with several geographers, and in an unusual turn, started actually reading textbooks. And in this case, network theory. Albert Laszlo Barabasi first started networks theory in the early 2000s when he started to trace websites on the World Wide Web, at that time still in an early date. And what he realized with his early research is that both on websites, but also in other natural interactions, these things are not spread evenly throughout connections, but rather that they are several hubs represent the most striking difference between random and scale-free network. So on the internet, there are certain hubs like Google or Facebook, these places that are centers of connections. But also in natural interactions, such as mushroom networks, mycelial networks, connections between trees in forests, you also see these examples of hubs. This parallels an insight from the pioneer sociologist of science, Robert Merton, on the Matthew effect. That is how the richer get richer and the poor get poorer, is that you have this idea of preferential attachment in network theory. That is, that these connections do not happen randomly or evenly, but rather at particular locus. So from these two sides, on the one hand, thinking about the ways that we can cross borders, and on the other hand, from network theory and from the history and sociology of science, I started thinking about the ways that we could borrow these to inform new studies of global history. What if we think about global history as a series of hubs that is both intellectual and physical, across time and across borders, and that the spokes are people, individual lives, but also certain ideas that cross these national boundaries and traditional periodization. And that if we think in this way, then we could locate around the world certain areas where people appear to gather. For the idea of frontiers and development, you see these hubs building in Hokkaido in the 1870s, in Chicago in the 1890s, in Suiyuan in the 1930s. This coming together of intellectual ideas, but also individuals, social scientists and scientists, in these ideas about development. This is the idea that informed my book, The Birth of the Geopolitical Age. And I use a global history methodology because of the way that it focuses on these connections. In particular, science and social sciences, geography and agricultural science, creating the space for such connections. Tracing the network between individuals whose ideas on frontiers and development crossed from academic debates to policy changes. And as it turns out, many of these people were educated in particular hubs, as I will show. The main argument coming out of this is the idea that the 20th century global circulation of imperialist as well as geopolitical discourse informed new ideas about frontiers, that this resulted in a new territoriality, a spatial reordering that focused on clearly defined borders, that was based on international law, and that focused, particularly geopolitical discourse, on the importance of natural resources and social Darwinism, as well as an organic understanding of the state. And I build these connections out of temporal as well as spatial hubs. My main argument is that this concept of geomodernity, which differs from geopolitics in the sense that this is a much broader examination of cultural and social factors that led to this spatial reordering, emerged from this unique dynamic during this transitional period from empire to nation state. And I also argue that empire continued to inform these ideas of the nation state, even as allegedly we entered a new age and the decline of empires. And in fact, we're seeing in many other fields, this recognition that empire continues to be an important even into the 21st century. As part of this transition, what we see occurring is an emergence of new global norms that run through the frontiers and borderlands around the world, with ideas on agricultural development, as well as a focus on modern science and boundary making. So let me show you through a couple of case studies. I won't have time to go through everything that I cover in the book, but I will, for today's talk, examine a couple of these hubs. To start with Hokkaido. I start with a couple of figures. One is William Smith Clark, who in the early 1850s went from Massachusetts to Germany to study. At the time, young Americans saw Europe and particularly German universities as a leading example of how higher education should be modeled. And here is a letter from the UMass Special Collections that he wrote to his father from Germany, describing how the higher education in Europe is so much more advanced than in the United States, because they have had a longer time to build up libraries, to allow people, researchers, the time to work on leading edge research. From Germany, where he received his PhD, Clark returned to the United States to teach at Dartmouth, and later was one of the first presidents of UMass Amherst, at the time Massachusetts Agricultural College. In the 1870s, Clark exchanged a number of letters with the Hokkaido Development Agency, Kaitakusha, and was then invited to serve as a special advisor to Sapporo College. Although he spent a brief amount of time there, he is still fondly remembered, and here is his statue, apparently with his parting words to the students at Sapporo: "Boys, be ambitious." It's interesting that higher education in the United States itself is built through the frontiers. That is, the Morrill Act in 1872, which established land-grant colleges in the United States, was funded through the allotment and sale of Western lands, at that time being dispossessed and with Indian tribes on these lands removed to reservations. Clark brought this model and also ideas of agricultural development to Hokkaido. At the same time, the Japanese also hired Horace Capron, briefly served as a commissioner in the United States Department of Agriculture, as advisor to the colonization of Hokkaido. Capron in the 1850s, while Clark went to study in Germany, was appointed special agent to the Texas-Mexico border, where he handled Indian affairs. And one of the first things he noted when he arrived in Hokkaido was that the Ainos reminded him of Indians, except less savage. Capron made a series of suggestions on the settlement of Hokkaido, on the agricultural development of Hokkaido. Many of these plans were extremely expensive and were never fully carried out. Yet the influence was lasting, because into the 1930s in Manchuria, they still referred to the development of Manchuria as along the lines of Capron Plan. This is the idea that the American Midwest, these endless fields of wheat, could serve as a model of development for frontiers around the world, even in many cases when it's not fully practical or in fact ever fully implemented. As we can see from these works, it was not only these ideas of frontier settlement, but also a certain language of frontiers, referring to lands which as virgin land. I discuss in my book how this idea of virgin land went to Japan, but also through Russia, arrived in China through translations in the early 20th century. The idea of, in Chinese, the 处女地, the virgin land, from these Western American, in many cases, these American examples of settlement. Through the expansion of the Japanese empire, these figures, such as Fukuzawa Yukichi and Goto Shinpei, carried ideas about development to the Asian mainland, and then finally during World War II to Southeast Asia. Fukuzawa Yukichi, for example, is well known for his 1885 essay, Escape from Asia, Ratsuran. But before he wrote this book, he also wrote a best-selling children's book in 1869, which popularized the concept of frontier in verse form. Another figure who arrived in Sapporo after the departure of both Clark and Capron, Nitobe Inazo, would from Hokkaido study in the US at Johns Hopkins and then in Germany, and subsequently coining the Japanese word 殖民地. So in the book, I discussed the idea that Sidney Lu has talked about in his book, which is the two different homonyms for 殖, with a different character for 殖民地, grounds for Palatine people, which I think he, in his case, was influenced by the German word Verpflanzung, or originally for the transplantation of trees, but then later on in the 19th century used also in intercolonization of East Prussia. Nitobe was part of a group of social scientists who pushed for the immigration and settlement for Japanese settlers to travel to North and South America, and from Hokkaido to North and South America, later on to Asia mainland. And after the closure of North America to South America. Through these ideas, as well as agricultural science texts, we see this idea circulate globally that the frontier could be an experimental zone. 试念 is a classical Chinese term that was already in use in the Song Dynasty. In Japan, it appeared in the 1847 Rangaku work, Introduction to Chemistry, by Utagawa Yoan. The work contained illustrations of various experiments, including a description of an electric battery. But within a few decades, the idea of 试念, the spatially distinct location for the conduct of science, was then expanded to in an agricultural sense, as in the agricultural zone, the laboratory for experimenting for various crops, as well as for veterinary studies. The idea of a 试念区 became extremely popular, circulated back to China as a neologism, and various agricultural texts also circulated in the press through, in this case, 农学报, which translated many directly from Japanese, and in a few cases from English sources, Western texts. These ideas of various agricultural technologies, as well as crops. In fact, by the late Qing into the early Republican years, the experimental zone, as in the 试念场, had spread throughout China, as you can see, using the local gazetteer tool, Logart, that the Max Planck Institute has developed. You can see these are the locations where 试念区 is mentioned in these gazetteers, and it is across China. This is a map from the Dali 通县志, and here you can see in this on this city map of here is the Nongling 试验区, distinctly located on the map. What you see is that this idea of the experimental zone crossed from the late Qing into the Republican period. It crossed from local elites in the late imperial period, the kind of people who compiled the gazetteers, into the same people who in the late Qing became revolutionaries, progressives, open schools. In this case, these are the compiler and editor of the Dali 通县志. So let me move on to the second hub, again with the frontier as a locus. Frederick Jackson Turner is famous in American history for shaping American history. He made his famous address on the frontier at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, which was named to celebrate the Columbus arrival in the New World. Here is the Chicago an overview of the Chicago World's Columbus Exposition in 1893. By that point, Chicago had grown in a period of hyper growth in the 19th century, from a few dozen settlers to over 1 million residents by the end of the century. And holding the World Exposition cemented its status as a world city. Right outside the grounds of the exposition was the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. By the 1890s, with the last of the Indian War settled and tribes removed to reservations, cowboys and Indians could now be played for entertainment rather than as a serious fear. But Chicago was also a hub for other reasons, in that not only was the American Historical Association held in conjunction at the World's Fair, but also a number of other figures arrived in the Columbian Exposition with the idea that so many of the frontiers around the world had closed. And from Chicago, they took their ideas about settlement development to other parts of the world where they hoped to would be some of the last outposts of frontiers. Turner was deeply influenced by American geography, but the idea of settlement and development was in fact also circulating in other circles. In the 1870s, a German geographer, Friedrich Rätzel, traveled to North America as a journalist and recorded his impressions, particularly the way that American cities, he noted Chicago and also the way that these vast hinterlands and new technologies of transportation are able to supply these cities. Importance of continental territory. A decade later, the German agronomist Max Ziering also toured North American homesteads on behalf of the Prussian government, which was growing concerned about the number of German immigrants who chose to go to the Americas rather than to settle farmsteads in further east where they could hold back against Poland. Subsequently, Max Ziering was one of the founders of the Society for Intercolonization in Prussia. But he was also a group of social scientists in Germany who viewed intercolonization as a vital tool of national defense, of the promotion of ethnic Germans, and the expansion of German territories holding out against the Polish borders to the east. In these planned settlements in East Prussia, the idea is that the social sciences could be used to distribute funding so that areas with a minority of ethnic Germans with the proper incentives could be pushed into the majority. Looking at these files, I realized the way that both intercolonization and external colonies, this is the view of Qingdao, published in German, that in fact, these divides are artificial. That rather the same ideas of planned development underpinned both external colonization or blue water colonies, as well as inner colonies. But ideologically, the inner colonies in East Prussia enjoyed much greater support among conservatives, as well as among academics and social scientists, who viewed ethnic German settlements as a way to push back against aristocratic land holdings and to encourage landed settlements for small farmers. Over decades, the idea that social science could be used to study these development, economic development, as well as agricultural development of these settlements. One from Germany, here is a publication. They published numerous studies of these ideas of intercolonization in East Prussia, but also to Germany. Kumao Takaoka's brother was the colonial administrator in Hokkaido, and to whom he dedicated this book, The Intercolonization Japans, published in 1904. Takaoka was also special in the way that he illustrates how one's career could stretch across different areas of the world and across different periods of Japanese history. So in the 1904 work, he is applying these methods to Hokkaido, to the study of Hokkaido. But also he was active in these study groups on fostering Japanese outward immigration. And in the 1930s, he was commissioned by the Japanese government to study Japanese settlers in Brazil, where outward immigration peaked in the 1950s in the post-war period. So we can see how these people's careers actually stretched across these different periodizations. The same with Max Ziering. He died in the late 1930s, but until the very end, he was very active in academic circles, corresponding with colleagues at Cornell University, colleagues in Asia, about holding conferences on agronomic studies. But someone like Rätzel, through his travels in the United States, later to become a chaired geography in Leipzig, these travels and global travels helped him to rethink the role of geography in the making of empire, and to develop ideas that underpinned geopolitical thinking in the 20th century, particularly the idea of Lebensraum, the idea that you need a certain amount of territory in order to survive as a country and as an organic state. Rätzel had a prominent American student, Ellen Zempel, one of the founders of the American Geographical Society, whose work, which cited Rätzel, her advisor, in the title, she was his only female student at Leipzig, and the only woman among 500 students in his economics and geography seminar. But the idea that a broad territorial base and security of possession are the central guarantees of national survival. In the 1930s, her work was translated into Chinese, and as was the writing of a number of other geopolitical thinkers. By the early 20th century, the key concepts in geopolitics was already in circulation. The word geopolitic was coined in the early 20th century by Rudolf Shellen. But some of the underlying ideas was in circulation among geographers and other social scientists already at this point. It was also circulating in a number of societies on intercolonization. Here is the archive of intercolonization. Again, you can see these are images very popular around the world in different kinds of publications, showing endless stretches of frontiers, the idea of this gridded settlement. Similarly, it made its way to China, where some of these ideas about settlement, especially, was implemented in the borderlands. So in Inner Mongolia, in Far West, also in Sichuan and Guizhou during World War II. As a pushback against Japanese imperialism, there was a hesitancy among Chinese writers to use the Japanese neologism 殖民地. Instead, by the 1920s and 1930s, writers used a number of these classical terms, and instead, what they use as intercolonization in English language works, in Chinese, they refer to as 屯垦. One example is of the military officer Zhou Zuohua, who was closely associated with Zhang Xueliang. Like a number of military officers, he's originally from Jilin, but he in fact had a very cosmopolitan educational background and attended a military academy in Japan. In 1928, Zhou Zuohua headed a effort at 屯垦 out in the Northeast as an effort to push back against Japanese expansion. This is the text of his 1928 speech, in which he viewed this 屯垦 effort in Xin'an as a way to push back against Western and Japanese imperialism, and also as an effort to help the Mengzu, the Mongolian Tongbao. So here is on the map where Xin'an is, basically in the middle of nowhere. This is a region that was very sparsely populated. And the troops set off for this area in the fall, which made no sense as an agricultural effort because you don't want to go start farming when the frost has already descended on these lands. But this was hardly an effort more at publicity rather than at actual building of a settlement. As you can see, where although they left after the growing season already ended, what they did bring was cameras as well as a printing press to print out their reports and to describe various efforts for these men to get up at 5 a.m. to instill this patriotic spirit and bring this to this land. It was successful as a publicity stunt, perhaps less successful as an actual building of any real roads or railroads or of farming the land. But what was very clear from the report that the real reason is because this is an area that is geopolitically important. And notice also how this language that has circulated in the American West, in Hokkaido against the Ainu, and also in Europe by ethnic Germans against the Poles who are lazy and wasteful and unsuccessful at reclaiming wastelands, is now also directed by Han Chinese officers against Mongolian nomads, that because they still rely on nomadism, they have wasted their lands. They have not planted crops nor developed the treasures of their mountains and forests. Within a year of the publication of the report from Xing'an, Montetsu had translated, including some of the maps that were rough sketches of maps that were done by the Chinese in their own report on this area. So Zhou Zhouhua was not wrong that there was a great deal of interest from other powers on this land. And in fact, sending men to these territories in the fall over the winter was not so much to open up farming, but as to occupy these territories against further encroachment and as an effort to draw attention to the region. Similarly, in the early 1930s, Yan Xishan in the Northwest, the warlord Yan Xishan in the Northwest, led an effort to settle the Suiyuan area. Although various efforts from the late Qing onward to develop the region had largely failed, by the 1930s, it was still viewed as an economically backwaters. But a great deal of interest was focused on this, and various study groups, including academics and social scientists, traveled to the region to investigate. In 1932, Yan Xishan led a group of officers in a twinking effort in the Suiyuan region. These efforts is also illustrative of various agronomist careers, in this case, Tang Xiyu. Tang had received his PhD in agricultural economics from Cornell University in 1924 with an economic study of Chinese agriculture. From this point, he was already promoting intercolonization for Chinese settlers as a way to bolster their defenses, but also because so many of the other frontiers and free lands were closed to Chinese settlers. In the 1920s, when he returned to China, he immediately joined Northwest Reclamation Planning Society, which was founded by Fen Yuxiang. His career continued during the wartime. He was a member of the Northwest Expedition in 1943 to Xinjiang. And in the 1950s, he joined cadre training, moved to Shanghai, and was active until illness led to early retirement. So people like Tang and other did these surveys of the Suiyuan region, including recognizing the fact that in order to carry out large-scale agriculture, they needed to build irrigation networks, but also the idea of developing 新农村 new villages. What is interesting is that this one effort, this 新农村 effort by Yan Xishan, so led to various publications around the country on 新农村, but also in the Northeast, the communists published a journal in 1949, also named 新农村. So the idea of these rural reconstruction efforts, this new development of these new mixed industrial agricultural villages across these political divides. And Yan, at least in these reports, claimed that they spared no expense in equipping these veterinary 试验场, these experimental zones, and also invited various agricultural scientists to study the output of this region. So let me move on to this final hub and the idea that from Versailles as a physical idea, but also a physical location after World War I, to the way that in the post-World War II period, reshaping of world order based on new interpretations of what an empire should be. The man who was the chief territorial specialist for the United States at Versailles was Isaiah Bowman. In 1915, Bowman was appointed director of the American Geographical Society. And as the head, he led the millionth map survey of Latin America. He was also the founder of one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is a direct result of the kind of networks that opened to him as a participant at Versailles. In the 1930s, Bowman was president of Johns Hopkins University and an advisor to President Roosevelt. In fact, by the 30s and 40s, he was widely viewed as the most powerful academic in the country and Roosevelt's geographer. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine, which is, really a sign that you've made it. In his work, The New World, which was published right after his return from Versailles in 1921 and onward, Bowman argued that this new idea of territorial possession. And here you can see from his 1937 article on population outlets in overseas territories. This is the idea that geographers were once called environmentalists, but today they are now capacitators. That is, modern science now enables people to settle even in remote and environmentally harsh regions of the world. This fundamentally changes the calculus of the frontier, but also of the way that these territories should be occupied. There are certainly overlaps in his ideas, and he influenced geopolitical thinkers in Europe, including Karl Hosofer in Germany. For Bowman, this was politically a very awkward thing, particularly during World War II. In his speech to the Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Georgia on May 13, 1937, he argued that this word geopolitic, that his idea was separate, that he would never argue for a forceful invasion, but rather that this was a invention of the kind of during the interwar period. And yet, if you actually look closely at his ideas, there is clearly he was unable to fully separate out how this is different, because in fact, he realizes the importance of resources for empires, and that one of the key things of holding on to territories is about access to key natural resources for industrialization. Bowman's list of international correspondences included Hu Huanyong, who was then the director of the Research Institute of Geography at National Central University. In the post-war period, he also corresponded with Zhang Junmai and made suggestions on how China might develop its sciences, as well as with geographer Zhang Qiyun, who left for Taiwan in the 1950s, was the Minister of Education. In the 1940s, Zhang Qiyun was one of 5 Chinese academics sponsored by the US State Department to exchange with the United States. When Zhang arrived in the United States, he immediately exchanged letters and correspondences with Isaiah Bowman to visit him in Baltimore, and also to secure from Bowman the preface to his forthcoming book on China in the New World. Bowman read the manuscript, and it's interesting that he recognized in someone else's work in another context that, in fact, it was very difficult to separate out these geographical aspirations and the political programs. Zhang had been very active in writing geography textbooks. He collaborated with Shu Hezhen on a geography textbook for secondary schools. But also during the war, like many other geographers, he had an ambitious program about how geography could promote Chinese nationalism. Bowman recognized in Zhang this idea, but he did not realize the full extent to which these ideas of frontier and also about these reclamation had in fact circulated widely in China long before and during the interwar period. Here is an assortment of various publications, both on the Japanese side, but also among these illustrated journals discussing various settlement plans around the world. But also during the war, even as the nationalist regime had to retreat to Chongqing and faced an existential crisis, the Ministry of Forestry as well as Defense continued to promote Twinken programs to have which submitted these reports. Here are these reports on the personnel on these reclamation farms, on Guizhou. The actual content of these reports are often less than complimentary. For this Liulong, Guizhou Liulong district, for example, they pointed out they lost over half of the harvest to insect damage. Another reclamation group in Guizhou grew increasingly desperate as a group of 600 refugees from Anhui arrived in Guizhou. They were promised this land that was supposedly had these villages easily accessible to it. But when they actually arrived, found the land very difficult, rocky and difficult to farm. And so the leader of the Guizhou group, Zhang Dexuan, wrote these increasingly desperate letters to Chongqing, explaining how basically shortly after their arrival, all able-bodied men abandoned or ran away, and they were left with children, elderly, and some women. The idea of the frontier would continue to reverberate in the post-war period. Isaiah Bowman, in fact, influenced this was key to the American conception of foreign policy in the post-World War II period, particularly the concept of a deterritorialized empire. That is, empire could no longer be necessarily due to physical occupation of territory, but rather through the sending out of experts to aid governments overseas, but also through the development of science. Vannevar Bush was deeply influenced by Bowman's vision of frontier in his seminal work, Science, the Endless Frontier. In fact, this document made the frontier the key driving force of American history. That is, from this report, that is the basic United States policy, that government should foster the opening of new frontiers. It opened the seas to clipper ships and furnished land for pioneers. Although these frontiers have more or less disappeared, the frontier of science remains. It is in keeping with the American tradition, one which has made the United States great, that new frontiers shall be made accessible for development by all American citizens. Yet, even as the frontier was nationalized, it also globalized, because what we see around the world is that for Japan, for China, in fact, the frontier also made itself into key parts of policy. In the case of China, in the post-war period, land reclamation was a key policy of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang in the West, as you can see from 1950 onward, when the Jiefangjuan arrived and when the PLA arrived in Xinjiang. So let me end today with what I started in my abstract, which is what exactly is this idea of geomodernity? Using the methodology of global history, I argue that geography and related fields of agricultural science contributed to this new territorial conception, that is, this global geomodernity. That it is based on this fixation with frontiers in different countries in very different historically specific ways, but also reliant on the deployment of science to exploit natural resources and enact development schemes in contested territories and in borderlands. That these countries that I discuss in the book, including the United States, Germany, China, Japan, all participated in new forms and reinterpretations of imperialism that depart from traditional empires and a strictly spatial concept of territory. In some ways, these are metaphorical, and other ways, but in fact, empire continues to inform state formation and ideas about territorial possession and power into the 21st century. I am going to end here and take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shellen, for this fascinating talk. I think it has shows and reveals the connection between the development of modern science, especially the agricultural science and the geography, and the modern understanding of the national territory, borders, frontiers. And I think now we coming to the Q&A session, and I haven't seen any questions in the box yet. So probably I'm the first one to ask the question. So I found that the topic actually is quite important, and I just wonder whether you could provide some more explanations on, I mean, as to the case of China, what's the difference of the ancient understanding of border and frontier? Like in the time of Kangxi and Qianlong, you know that Kangxi, in the time of the Nibuchu Tiaoyue, Treaty of Nershsk in the second half of the 17th century. And actually at that time, with the help of the Jesuits, the West Catholic missionaries, he has already have a concept of this territory and the border between China and between Qing Empire and the Russian Empire. So what's the difference between these understanding of border and frontier between Kangxi's period and the modern understanding? I mean, in early Republican. So could you provide some more explanations? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, because actually in all of these cases, in Germany and Japan, you have history that predates all these 20th century discussions, because the settlement of Eastern Europe, for example, you have the Knights Templar doing. So there is a prehistory to it, and these understandings that what I tried to show is that in the 19th and 20th century, for these countries, what they're taking is both their own historically specific understanding, because of course the frontier in the late Qing also, there's a lot of discussions about the West and about Xinjiang and how relating Xinjiang to Taiwan, and how these could be firmed up in order for the Qing Empire. So you have what is a very historically specific discussion, but then also people recognize that there are these ideas coming in from the outside. And some of these are circulating through these networks that are opened up in agricultural science among geographers. What you have are these various conferences, International Congress of Geographers, on these international agronomic conferences, these circulation of these plans of development, or so-called scientific development of these regions. So it's very difficult to separate out that what is in fact, what are they, because in some of these handbooks on Tunken, for example, published during they discuss Qing efforts, and then they talk about the Soviet Union, and they talk about the New Deal in the United States. So there is both this attention to its own history, to Chinese history, but also to examples of what's going on in other parts of the world. And then this comes in to combine to form these, in many cases, these are build. So the example that I show in Xing'an, for example, this is billed as growing out of a distinctly Chinese tradition, even to the point of leaving out some of the stuff. So basically, Zhou Zhouhua says this is Tuntian is basically a Chinese, because we see that in the Han Dynasty. But of course, what's also going on is that he is looking right at the Japanese.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think we have more questions here. So should I just read it, or maybe to save the time, Shellen, you just directly answer that question?
No, I think Shankar, you should read it because people can't see what is being asked.
Okay. So the first question came from Chen Chen. Thank you, Professor Wu's wonderful speech. I have a question. How do you define the concept of frontier? And can we also count global metropolitans of a constant and intense intellectual and economic interchanges as frontiers? So what is the difference between the concept of frontiers as experimental zones and the concept of third space? So this is the first question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that, so I explain more in the book about how I think the concept of frontier is relational. This is like the periphery. I mean, periphery to what, right? And so, but many of the figures I look at use the word with certain assumptions that it is already defined, but in fact, it's not. So for people who are living in Suiyuan, that's not the frontier, that's just where they live. And I do think that there is a lot of slippage in the usage of these words, as well through the process of translation, which then hides more than it elucidates. And this is also related to various other words, including science, 科学. I mean, what exactly do you mean by that? And also wasteland. In many cases, a wasteland, it could be defined wasteland by one set of people. For others, it's actually ecologically important, wetlands. So these are constantly shifting terms. And I think, yes, so depending on how you think about it, certainly these metropolitan areas could also be frontiers. This is just related to what perspective you assume.
So shall we, the second question? Yeah. Dear Professor Wu, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. So could you please talk a little bit about the role of periodicals in communicating these ideas, not just through text, but especially image? I noticed in particular your references to 新中华, the journal 新中华, and 新亚西亚, but was this other in particular? I'm assuming Manchuria graph. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the periodicals, particularly the images, promote certain ideas about development. What you see is that there is certain commonality to these images, whether they are published in Western journals, in Chinese, in Japanese. This idea of this gridded land that James Scott talks about, that is the image that is promoted through these periodicals around the world about what is a productive use of space, as opposed to wetland, which would be considered a wasteland. So again, I think that these periodicals, these journals, are very important in promoting to a wider public certain ideas about development.
So, yeah, the next one. Thanks for the presentation. It would be great if you could say a few words on the correspondence between Bowman and Carson Zhang. Wow.
Yeah, so Bowman exchanged a lot of correspondences with people because of his various roles with the State Department. Carson Chan arrived in the United States to attend the San Francisco conference. And this is when he wrote to Bowman and they exchanged some letters so Bowman suggested that China focus on the practical sciences, including geology, to develop resources. And so with certain practical fields that would be pay off dividend in development. And actually, this is the same advice that the Soviet Academy of Science gave to the Chinese Academy of Science in the 1950s, which is a focus on these applied fields first.
Yeah. So the next question, thank you. And would you please say more about how the 绥远屯垦, yeah, is related to the geopolitical theory, whether the 屯垦 benefited the local government?
So yes. So the idea about the settlement is that not only would it allow for rural reconstruction, these 新农村, this new village, but also they would be buffers in the borderlands. And in fact, locals try to attract the attention of the central government. So I looked at correspondences. So some of these villages in Guizhou, like they wrote to Chongqing to request, to say that we have room for settlers to come. And the idea is that, these efforts, however much, even if you only get a fraction of what is actually, budgeted, you're getting something. You're getting these outside surveyors, you're getting people to come and help with the development. These are very often very poor areas. One of the key problems is the lack of infrastructure and access connections to the railroads and to other roads. So the importance of these development scheme is not only promoted from above by planners and bureaucrats, but also oftentimes you have from below or from people from localities, they volunteer their area for these Tunken. Because of course, then you're getting attention from the central government, and however little of the money you're getting something as opposed to nothing. But yeah, so geopolitically, yes, this was key that, basically this is the buffer. So once you bring these settlers in, the idea is it's harder to have an invasion.
Yeah. So the next question is, let me see. So at one point you made a reference to discussion of the South Seas. Could you give us some more detail about the area that was not being referred to? Did the author mean South China Sea or South Pacific or another area?
I think this is the letter, this is maybe from Zhang Xiyun. So during the war, you have a number of geographers published works, but also this continues the tradition of the national humiliation maps that showing the areas lost to imperialism, which includes Korea, Vietnam, includes, a lot of these areas. And I point out in the book that this is actually not based on any historical evidence or historical maps, but rather this is inculcated in a way to stir outrage so that the central government would promote the study of geography. So Bai Meichu wrote to the Chongqing government, it's like, all students should just study geography and also go out to do field work. And they should study, conditions and resources in their areas, because otherwise the imperialists just come and they take all this land away. So this when they refer to this, it's often very poorly defined. I mean, I don't know how many people actually thought that China was going to get Vietnam back, Yeah.
So I think we have a lot of questions. Next one, let me see. Yeah, here. I have a question about the role of frontier in the global geomodernity. As we can see many examples of frontier land in this study, many of them, especially the ones in China, remained as kind of undeveloped areas, or at least third-tier regions. If these frontier areas used to be hubs, and how do we understand their current status as relatively undeveloped? What kind of benefits for frontier area during the global geomodernity movements, or they only served as resource pool at periphery to support the development of center?
Yeah.
Wow.
That is a great question. You're absolutely right that many of these regions continue to be quite poor. And that is because of the dynamic. They are hubs in that they attracted a lot of attention from social scientists. In many cases, these development could not be fully implemented because people actually did not want to go there. So it's one thing to go on an investigation trip, research trip, for two weeks or a month, or it's another thing to actually go out there to open up these areas. And so you're absolutely right that in many cases, what is viewed as important about these regions is less about elevating poverty in the region itself, but rather than extracting resources. So in Xing'an, for example, although these officers talked about aiding Mongolian compatriots, what they were interested in was logging and in the opening of mines. So for sociologists talk about this process of ecologically unequal exchange. And you see that happening in regions like the Amazon or in parts of Africa, where you have the extraction of resources, but in fact, these areas themselves remain quite poor.
So let me see. So the next question comes from a PhD student from Peking University. I have two questions. First, you mentioned 殖民地 is different from colonization. I want to know more about that. And you mentioned a scholar once discussed it. Could you tell me the name of the scholar? And second question is, you focused the case in China, mostly in the Northwest. So I wonder if there's more colonization ideas or practice in Southeast Asia. Sorry, where is it?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I typed in his name. So Sidney Lu's work, he is a Japan historian at Rice University, but his book on Japanese settler colonialism, he discusses the etymology of 殖民地. So the first, in the 1870s, the initial 殖 is the meaning population propagation. And so Sidney Lu coined this concept of Malthusian expansionism. And this, the idea is that because these Japanese islands are overpopulated, how do you alleviate rural poverty by encouraging these farmers to go in settler colonialism? And he talks about how, so Sidney Lu discusses how Nitobe Inazo in the early 1900s has an essay about explaining why he's now switching the 殖 to the plant side, the 木字旁, the 殖. And there is a shift in the underlying concept of the 殖民, from this Malthusian to an economic and to this, transplantation concept. And I'm sorry, the second part of the question was, oh, yes. So yes, particularly in the 30s, there was a lot of discussion about Southeast Asia. And this was also when the Chongqing government in particular There's a lot of exchanges with prominent figures, and also because of the border dispute with Britain over the Yunnan Miandian border. So there was ideas that, that settlements could also aid in these border disputes. So yes, absolutely. So these discussion is not limited to a particular region, but people do talk about how because of the Japanese encroachment in the Northeast, and they shifted their attention to the Northwest, and then during the war, it moved to the Southwest, Southeast border.
So yeah, I just type in the box that if you want to know more about the changing meaning of the Chinese word 殖民地 in Chinese context, so there's a article written by the Taiwan scholar Pan Guangzhe. So the name is 从新名词到关键词以殖民地为例. As I study conceptual history, and I think the article is quite important about the Chinese concept 殖民地, the changing meaning of it from late period China, from late Qing to early republic. So let me see. Which one? This one. Yeah. And so the question is, in what way were the projects of Tunken in hinterland China offering an example for Maoist China's more radical cooperative experiments? Some scholars believe that the Chinese regions more successful in cooperativist experiments, such as Manchuria, Shanxi, and Hebei, were also comparatively less drastically impact during the Age of People's communes, with the local cadres obtaining more experiment from the purist area.
Yeah. You see the connection, because intellectually it's not as though there was a clear division in 1949. And in fact, from Yan'an, what in the 90s, a lot of these reports on like Xinjiang, Bingtun efforts is that they talk about how they were inspired by the Nanyuan outside of Yan'an, and that is in the 40s, and they talk about the Tunken there. So these ideas from this 20s and 30s were very broad and crossing these political lines, and then continue to influence these ideas about cooperative farming into the Maoist years, even as the actual practices changed, and in some cases took on new forms.
Yeah. So the next one, you spoke of the motivation of colonialism for exploitation of resources and territorial claims. Could you speak further of views on the people who occupied these frontier spaces in more traditional colonized spaces? Human bodies were often viewed and treated like a commodity to be controlled and exploited by the colonial state.
Yeah, so this is one of the things I mentioned, is that with geopolitics, what is frequently the focus is on state actors, and also on that people are just like chess pieces. This is also the idea that you have these settlers could be buffers. I mean, so basically what that is suggesting is that these people would be cannon fodder once, there's an invasion. And I guess it could slow down whatever invasion. But in fact, this was also one of the major issues that comes up in China, as well as in other contexts, is the gender issue. And it turns out that in Germany, the promotions and settle incentives for farming in East Prussia was not attractive to women at all. How many actual people wanted to, in an industrializing country, wanted to move to a countryside and perhaps have like 10 children? I mean, this is what planners envisioned. And then the reality is that people did not want to go. Particularly, this was unattractive to young women. So there is absolutely a disparity between the discourse and what goes on the ground. So what you have is meetings in Berlin, in Chongqing, in Nanjing, discussions about these. And then what happens on the ground, which in many cases was completely different. And what you also see is on the ground, when people are actually put in those situations, what happens, and sometimes it's like in Guizhou, they're like, this is horrible, we can't farm. We're completely desperate. We need more help. So that's the human part of what's happening with these.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the next question is, can you please comment on the Flying Express, 飞天, that referring to a spiritual being in Hindu and Buddhist culture painted by Chinese craftsmen in Morris in the Mogao grottos during the 16th Kingdoms 16国 period. They are considered a touchstone of the diverse cultural exchange in world history as it witnesses the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road into China. Do you believe that culture can dismiss frontiers?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that, I'm not sure what that necessarily means for culture to discuss frontiers. These areas are all, they shift, the frontiers shift over time. And but I do believe that in the late 19th century, we have this global moment aided by the professionalization of history writing, aided by the rise of science and social sciences, in which the frontier assumed an outsized importance in official discourse. And that this informed many of the policies that then took place in countries around the world. I don't know this is a dismissal from a cultural perspective, but rather the way that you have certain views elevated by various states around the various countries around the world.
So the next one, I wonder if I may ask a question clarifying how you conceptualize the relationship between geomodernity and the particular history of the United States. Is the relationship primarily one related to development of hierarchies of knowledge production, or is it related to the early status of the United States as a model for settler colonialism, with German geographers and European colonial thinkers in the 19th century leading the early discourse even before the Americans you talk about? In other words, how central is the US case for the conceptualization of geomodernity?
I think the United States is key to the conceptualization of geomodernity, both because the American West becomes this model for countries to aspire to, as you see in the case of Japan, but also because it shaped these geographical ideas about these ratio of land to of the importance of hinterland to urban cities, and also in a negative sense to the dispossession and removal of indigenous populations. So I didn't have space to go into it for the talk today, but the concept of central place theory, but also Rachel, when he traveled in North America in the 1870s, noted urbanization in the US and also the development of railroads, so new technologies of transportation that made all the more important the availability of vast hinterland to supply resources for these large mega cities that develop. So cities like Chicago could exist because of these railroad networks. Industries like the meat industry, you could have meat that is, grown in one part of the country in the countryside, then transported on rail in refrigerated cars across the country. And that transforms this possibilities for development. And yes, absolutely. I think the United States is a central model that other countries aspire to and look to as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think this is the last question. Thank you for the great insights. You mentioned how these development plans of underdeveloped regions have served the purpose of claiming territories from a political and economical perspective. Could you elaborate more on how they have facilitated the transformation from imperial states to nation state modernity from a cultural and social perspective? Wow. Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have time to go into it today, but one of the things I look at is the Perry mission to Asia. And actually, if you look at the reports from Admiral Perry's mission, a lot of people know about, quote unquote, the opening of Japan, but actually they spent a lot of time on the Ryukyu Islands. And this is where you see this transformation and for the recognition in Japan that what was practiced in Ryukyu to have this ambiguous status, and this is also true for Korea, to pay tribute to the Qing, but then also acknowledge the Japanese, that would no longer be possible. And that sets off a whole series of these changes in how these countries themselves, but also how these states addressed this. So it's really in the wake of this that Japan pivots, because they had relations with Hokkaido before arrival of Western ships, but now suddenly you have to reorient, incorporate it into the country so that you firm up the borders. Because of the recognition that otherwise you're going to lose it, because there are other competing powers that are deeply interested in this and no longer accept this ambiguity of status.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, what's a fascinating session of questions and answers. And actually, I learned a lot personally from these discussions. And I think it also shows that it is a quite meaningful topic about this, the shape of modern national territories and modern understanding of frontiers and borders. And I think so. As the time it's 9:30 now, so perhaps we just come to the end of the talk. So would you like to say something, Tansen?
No, thank you to Shellen and to you, Janke. I think it was a great start to the semester. Thank you, Shellen. Thank you, Janke. And thank you all the audience members.